What causes mesothelioma? In this video, I'll show you the real causes of mesothelioma that most people never learn about, including how something as simple as a family hug could have put you at risk. Hi, I'm Deborah from Surviving Mesothelioma. We've helped over 18,000 mesothelioma patients worldwide through our best-selling book, Surviving Mesothelioma, written by Kraus. Paul survived mesothelioma for over 27 years without chemotherapy, radiation, or surgery. Today, I'll cover the three main ways that people get exposed to asbestos, including the only known cause of mesothelioma and why companies hid this from you. How family hugs and doing laundry could have exposed you to deadly asbestos fibers, and the shocking products in your home that contain asbestos without warning labels. So number one, asbestos is the only cause of mesothelioma. So here's what you need to know. Asbestos exposure is the only known cause of mesothelioma. There is no other way to get this disease. Understanding this helps you figure out when and where you're exposed to asbestos. And this information may be important if you want to access asbestos trust funds or to understand your legal rights. Plus, knowing the real cause helps to answer the question that keeps you up at night. Why me? But how does asbestos cause mesothelioma? Once you understand this, everything else will make sense. Asbestos is a naturally occurring mineral that was used in thousands of products because it doesn't burn and it's really strong. But here's the problem. When asbestos is disturbed, it breaks apart into tiny fibers, and they are so small, you can't even see them. We're talking about fibers that are 700 times thinner than human hair. When you breathe in these microscopic fibers, they travel deep into your lungs and sometimes get stuck in the lining around your lungs, which is called the pleura. If you swallow them, they can settle in the lining of your abdomen called the peritoneum. And then in rare cases, they can even reach the lining around your heart. But here's the scary part. Once these fibers get lodged in your body, they may never come out. Your body can't break them down or get rid of them. They just sit there for decades, causing irritation and inflammation. And over time, usually 20 to 50 years later, this constant irritation may cause the healthy cells to become cancerous. And that is how mesothelioma develops. Now, here's what really just makes me angry. Companies knew asbestos was dangerous as early as 1949, and that is over 70 years ago. But instead of protecting workers and warning people, they chose to hide this information to protect their profits. They put money over people's lives. One executive from Bendix, which is now Honeywell, actually said, quote, "If you have enjoyed a good life while working with asbestos products, why not die from it?" End quote. Can you believe that? That's how little they cared about the people who made them rich. The good news is that because of this corporate cover-up, asbestos trust funds were created to compensate people like you who have developed mesothelioma. And these companies were forced to set aside billions of dollars to pay victims, and you may be entitled to compensation from these funds. But first, you need to understand exactly how you were exposed to asbestos. The lawyers usually do this for you, but it's good for you to understand, which brings us to our next point about workplace exposure. So, point number two, here's what you need to know. Most mesothelioma cases come from workplace asbestos exposure. If you worked in certain industries between the 1940s and the 1980s, you were likely exposed to dangerous levels of asbestos on the job. But here's why this matters. Figuring out your workplace exposure is important because it helps determine which companies are responsible for your illness and which asbestos trust fund you may be able to access for compensation. There are over 60 trust funds, so knowing where you worked and what products you used can affect how much compensation you may receive. But how do people get exposed on the job? So let's walk through some of the jobs and industries where asbestos exposure was heaviest. Construction workers had some of the highest exposure rates. If you worked in construction, you may have been surrounded by asbestos every single day. It may have been in the insulation you installed, the roofing materials that you put up, the floor tiles you laid down, and the drywall compounds that you used. Every time you cut, you sanded, or you removed these materials, you were potentially breathing in asbestos fibers. Many shipyard workers also faced massive exposure. The Navy used asbestos in boiler rooms, engine rooms, and throughout the ship for fireproofing. If you worked in shipyards during World War II or the decades after, you could have been working in some of the most contaminated environments imaginable. Auto mechanics, especially diesel mechanics, could have dealt with asbestos every time they changed brake pads or clutches. Before 1980, when you used compressed air to blow out brake dust, you were probably blowing asbestos fibers into the air and probably breathing them in. Brake pads and clutches were made with asbestos because they could handle the heat from friction. Factory workers in steel mills, power plants, and manufacturing facilities are often exposed through insulation around pipes, boilers, and different machinery. If you worked around high heat equipment, there was probably asbestos insulation nearby. Even electricians, plumbers, and HVAC workers were exposed when they worked around asbestos-containing materials in buildings and homes. This isn't the full list of jobs or industries, but it gives you a good idea. But here's the worst part. Most workers had no protective equipment, no masks, no warnings, nothing. Companies knew these products contained asbestos, but they didn't tell workers. You were never warned that the materials that you worked with every day could kill you decades later. And here's something that might shock you. Even brief exposures could be enough to cause mesothelioma. You didn't have to work with asbestos for years and years. Some people develop mesothelioma just from a few weeks or months of exposure. The companies that made these asbestos products knew they were dangerous, but they kept selling them anyway. And that is why asbestos trust funds exist today. Companies like Johns Manfield, Owens Corning, and dozens of others were forced to create these funds to compensate workers like you who got sick from their products. If any of these job descriptions sound familiar, you should document exactly where you worked and what products you used. This information could be worth hundreds of thousands of dollars in compensation from asbestos trust funds. But workplace exposure wasn't the only way people got mesothelioma. Sometimes the exposure happened much closer to home, which brings us to our next point. Number 3, secondary exposure to family members. All right, here's what you need to know. Family members could unknowingly bring asbestos home on their clothes, their hair, their skin. And this means you could have been exposed to deadly asbestos fibers without ever setting foot in a workplace that used asbestos. This explains how people with no direct workplace exposure develop mesothelioma. If you're wondering, but I never worked around asbestos, secondary exposure might be your answer. Understanding this also helps to identify which family members' workplace exposure might have caused your illness, which is important for accessing the right asbestos trust funds. So let me paint a picture that might sound very familiar to you. Imagine your husband, father, or any other family member coming home from work every day. They worked in construction, a shipyard, or maybe they were a mechanic. At the end of their shift, they come through the front door, they're tired, but they're happy to see you, and you'd rush over for a big hug, not knowing that it could be potentially life-threatening. Here's what was actually happening. Asbestos fibers are microscopic. We're talking about particles so small you can't see them with the naked eye. When someone works around asbestos, these nearly invisible fibers act like tiny hitchhikers. They stick to work clothes, they get caught in hair, and they cling to skin. So when your family member came home and you hugged them, those asbestos fibers jumped ship. They transferred from their clothes to yours. But it gets worse. These fibers, they don't just stick to clothes, they float in the air. And then before you know it, you're breathing them in. And here's something that happened in thousands of homes across America. Doing the laundry sometimes became a deadly chore. Wives would shake out their husband's work clothes before washing them. And every time they did this, they were releasing clouds of asbestos fibers into the air. The laundry room became contaminated. And then anyone in the house could breathe in these fibers. Children were especially at risk. They would run up to dad when he would come home from work not knowing his clothes were covered in asbestos. Kids play on the floor where asbestos fibers had settled. Some children even played with their father's work clothes or their hard hats. And this type of exposure is called secondary exposure or take-home exposure, and it's more common than you might think. Studies have shown that wives and children of asbestos workers develop mesothelioma at much higher rates than the general population. The tragic part is that families had no idea that this was happening. There were no warnings, no protective measures, nothing. Companies knew that workers were bringing asbestos home to their families, but they never warned anyone about the dangers. If you're thinking about your own situation, ask yourself these questions. Did your spouse, parent, or other family member work around asbestos? Did you ever wash their work clothes? Did you hug them when they came home from work? If you answered yes to any of these questions, secondary exposure may be how you were exposed to asbestos. And here's the important part. You may still be entitled to compensation from asbestos trust funds based on your family member's workplace exposure. But secondary exposure wasn't the only way. Asbestos snuck into people's homes. Sometimes the danger was hiding in everyday products that families used without any warning, which brings us to our next point. Number 4, contaminated consumer products. Many household products contained asbestos without proper warning labels. There were everyday items that families used in their homes completely unaware that they were being exposed to a deadly carcinogen. This helps explain cases where people can identify obvious exposure sources. If you never worked around asbestos, you don't have a family member who did, contaminated consumer products might be how you were exposed. So understanding this also reveals another source of, again, potential compensation. Many of these product manufacturers have asbestos trust funds. So let's start with talcum powder and baby powder. When companies mined talc from the ground, they often accidentally scooped up asbestos too, because these minerals are found close together in nature. But instead of being extra careful to keep asbestos out of personal care products or products used on children, many companies ignored the contamination. Every time you used talcum powder or baby powder, you could have been breathing in asbestos fibers. When you sprinkled it on yourself, your baby, those tiny particles became airborne. Women who used talcum powder for feminine hygiene were at especially high risks because they were using this product regularly for years. Hair dryers from the 1970s were another hidden danger. Many contained asbestos in the heating element. Every time you dried your hair, hot air was blowing asbestos fibers right at your face. You were breathing them in while trying to look your best. Even kitchen appliances weren't safe. Toasters, ovens, and other heat-producing appliances often contained asbestos insulation. So when these appliances heated up, asbestos fibers could be released into your kitchen air. Your home itself might have been full of asbestos. Floor tiles, especially the 9-inch by 9-inch tiles that were popular for decades, often contained asbestos. Ceiling tiles, especially those textured popcorn ceilings, frequently had asbestos. The joint compound used to finish drywall contained asbestos. Even some paints and caulks contained asbestos. But here's something that sounds like it's from a horror movie. Fake snow used in Christmas decorations and even in Hollywood movies contained asbestos. Remember the snow in The Wizard of Oz? That was asbestos. Families would use this fake snow to decorate their Christmas trees, not knowing they were covering their homes with cancer-causing materials. Even children's toys weren't safe. Some crayons and toy makeup sets contained asbestos. Kids would use these products, and parents had no idea they were exposing their children to danger. The really infuriating part is that companies often knew about the asbestos dangers, but they didn't warn consumers. They figured it would cost too much money to clean up their manufacturing processes, so they just kept selling contaminated products. But Why did asbestos companies hide the truth? Asbestos companies deliberately concealed health risks from workers and from the public for decades. This wasn't an accident or an oversight. It was a calculated decision to put profits over people's lives. Internal company documents that came out during lawsuits revealed that asbestos companies knew their products caused cancer as early as the 1940s. That's right, they had scientific evidence that asbestos was deadly more than 80 years ago. But instead of warning workers or finding safer alternatives, they chose to hide this information. Even when workers started getting sick and dying in large numbers, companies continued to deny that asbestos was the cause. They blamed other factors like smoking or claimed that workers had pre-existing conditions. They spent millions of dollars on lawyers to fight every single lawsuit. Here's what these companies didn't count on: the lawyers and investigators who wouldn't give up. During the 1970s and 1980s, lawsuits forced these companies to turn over their internal documents. And that is when the world finally learned the truth about what they had known all along. The evidence was so overwhelming that courts started ordering these companies to pay massive damages to victims. But many companies declared bankruptcy to try to avoid paying. And that is when judges stepped in and forced them to create asbestos trust funds. These trust funds weren't created out of the goodness of these companies' hearts. They were forced to set aside billions of dollars to compensate people like you who got sick from their products. Over 60 companies have been required to create these trust funds, and they contain around $30 billion for asbestos victims. So here's what you need to understand. When you file a claim with an asbestos trust fund, you are not asking for a handout. You are seeking compensation for what these companies deliberately did to you. They knew their products were killing people, and they sold them anyway because they cared more about money than human lives. Every single person that develops mesothelioma from asbestos exposure is a victim of this corporate cover-up. These companies stole your health, and in many cases, they stole years of your life. The least that they can do is pay for your medical bills and provide financial security for your family. So now you know the truth about what causes mesothelioma. It is not bad luck. It is not simply genetics, and it is not something that you did wrong. You developed mesothelioma because greedy corporations chose profits over your life. They knew asbestos was deadly. They hid that information from you, and they continued selling dangerous products for decades. But here's what I want you to remember. Mesothelioma does not have to be a death sentence. Paul Kraus proved that when he survived over 27 years using approaches that didn't involve chemotherapy, radiation, or even surgery, he showed thousands of patients that there are other ways to fight this disease and maintain a good quality of life. If you want to learn exactly how Paul survived mesothelioma for over 27 years and discover the specific approaches that he used to beat the odds, click the first link in the description below to get your free copy of Surviving Mesothelioma shipped overnight to your door. This book contains all of Paul's survival secrets, including the 5 lifestyle changes that helped put the brakes on his mesothelioma, his quality of life formula that kept him pain-free and energetic, and the 3 simple questions to ask your doctor when starting any new treatment. Or if you want to understand your legal rights and learn how to access these asbestos trust funds that the companies were forced to create, click the link in the description. You may be entitled to compensation, and you deserve every penny after what these companies put you through. Remember, over 18,000 mesothelioma patients have already gotten their copy of Paul's book, and it can make all the difference in your fight against this disease. As always, wishing you the best of health, and I'll see you in the next video.